No one noticed the decision Scott made each night. There was no announcement, no declaration, no promise spoken out loud. But that quiet decision, repeated in silence, slowly rewrote his entire life. Years later, people would call it discipline. Some would call it luck. Others would say he had always been gifted. None of them knew the truth. Because the moment Scott stopped talking about his dreams was the moment they finally started surviving. They used to call him the quiet one, and never kindly. In Scott's town, noise was currency. The loudest voice won the room. The boldest claim earned respect. The fastest talker looked like the smartest man. Silence, on the other hand, was treated like absence. Scott felt it every day. He felt it walking to school while others laughed too loudly. He felt it sitting in class, knowing answers he never rushed to shout. He felt it at home, where effort was measured by how convincingly you could explain your plans, not by what you quietly worked on. Scott had dreams. Big ones. But they didn't sound impressive when spoken out loud. He imagined a life shaped by meaning, not survival. A life built slowly, carefully, intentionally. Every time he shared those dreams, something happened. People smiled, but not with belief. They nodded, but added warnings. They spoke of realism, responsibility, and risk. Each sentence chipped away at something fragile. Scott noticed the pattern before he understood it. The more he spoke, the smaller the dream felt afterward. Not impossible. Just exposed. At night, he lay awake replaying conversations he wished he'd never had. Words he wished he could take back. Dreams that felt lighter, thinner, after being spoken. He didn't know why. He only knew this. Talking made the future feel farther away. Scott began to withdraw. Not dramatically. Not noticeably. He simply stopped sharing. He still showed up. Still studied. Still practiced. Still imagined something more. But the effort was invisible. Others talked about their plans loudly. Scott worked quietly. Others celebrated ideas. Scott worked on habits. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. Inside, everything felt heavy. Was he falling behind? Was silence a mistake? Was he confusing patience with fear? The world rewarded those who spoke. Scott wondered if quiet people were simply forgotten. One afternoon, on his walk home, Scott noticed something unusual. At the edge of an abandoned field, an old man knelt in the dirt. No sign. No audience. No explanation. The man pressed seeds into the soil with deliberate care, one by one, then covered them gently, smoothing the earth as if protecting something delicate. Scott walked past. The next day, the man was there again. And the next. Always early. Always gone before anyone noticed. People passed without slowing down. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. Planting seeds in land no one believed could grow anything. Scott didn't know why it stayed with him. But something about the repetition, the silence, the lack of explanation, felt different. Like watching effort without performance. Before we go deeper, pause for a moment. Stories like this take time and care to craft, stories meant to stay with you long after the video ends. If you value wisdom that doesn't shout, but quietly changes how you see your life, subscribe below. And have you ever felt like your effort didn't matter because no one noticed? Share below. Now, let's continue. The afternoon sunlight was soft, warm, and still, casting long shadows over the abandoned field where Scott had first noticed the old man. That day had begun like any other. School had ended, homework awaited, and the chatter of classmates filled the streets. But something in Scott tugged at him, an unexplainable pull toward the man who had become a quiet mystery in his young life. He had seen him working day after day, kneeling in the soil, pressing seeds into the earth, covering them with care, and never speaking more than a few words to anyone. Scott approached cautiously, unsure whether he should interrupt the man or merely observe. There was something in the deliberate pace, the silence, that commanded respect without demanding attention. The old man seemed entirely absorbed, moving with a rhythm that Scott instinctively felt was important but couldn't yet name. The way he pressed each seed into the soil was careful, almost reverent, as if he were protecting something far more valuable than the barren ground. "Why do you come here every day?" Scott finally asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. The old man looked up slowly, his hands still streaked with dirt, and smiled. "Because anything still becoming needs protection," he said. "And protection begins with silence." Scott frowned. "I don't understand. How does being quiet protect anything?" The old man chuckled softly, a sound that felt like the rustle of leaves. "When a seed is first placed in the ground, it is vulnerable. If you dig it up to show it to someone, if you expose it to the world too soon, it dies. The same is true for dreams. When they are small, fragile, and untested, the opinions, doubts, and expectations of others can crush them before they have a chance to grow." Scott stared at the dirt beneath his feet, trying to visualize what the old man meant. He thought about all the times his own ideas, hopes, and visions had been spoken aloud and met with skepticism. How quickly encouragement could sour into doubt. How praise often came with pressure, reshaping the dream until it no longer resembled the original spark that had inspired it. "Do you mean you've never shared your dreams?" Scott asked. "Once," the old man admitted, his voice carrying a subtle weight of regret. "I was young and eager. I told everyone what I wanted to do before it was ready. And just as the world shifted its eyes on me, everything I had hoped for wilted. Opinions trampled it. Expectations twisted it. Doubt poisoned it. And the seed never had a chance." Scott's heart sank as he imagined the old man's disappointment, but also a spark ignited within him. This was no ordinary man. This was someone who had learned through experience the delicate balance between silence and growth. "So now," the old man continued, pressing another seed gently into the soil, "I work where no one interferes. Seeds grow best underground. No applause. No validation. No criticism. Just darkness, patience, and time. If I dig them up to prove they exist, they die." Scott leaned closer, fascinated. "And this really works?" The old man nodded. "It does. But it is not easy. Silence feels unnatural. The world is loud, impatient, and always watching. To resist that is to honor what is becoming. To protect what is fragile. To care for what might change everything if it is allowed to survive." Scott watched as the man straightened, brushing his hands clean, and took a small step back to survey the field. Each row, each carefully planted seed, was a testament to patience and unseen effort. There was no rush, no need for recognition. Every action was deliberate, slow, purposeful. And Scott realized that this was what true wisdom looked like: action without show, discipline without applause, protection without fanfare. For the next several weeks, Scott returned to the field almost every day. He observed the old man silently, asking only the occasional question, absorbing the rhythm of the work. He began to notice patterns: how the old man moved, the care with which he chose each spot, the way he never grew impatient, even when the soil resisted or the weather interfered. Scott felt a quiet stir inside himself, a yearning to replicate not just the action but the mindset, the calm, patient devotion to what mattered most. The old man rarely spoke directly about philosophy, and never in a lecture. Instead, his lessons came through gestures, repetition, and the subtle flow of his work. Each kneeling motion, each careful covering of a seed, became a metaphor for life itself. Scott began to understand that wisdom was not always spoken, it was lived, practiced, and observed. He learned that the smallest, quietest actions could have profound consequences if they were done with patience and care. One afternoon, Scott finally voiced a thought he had been wrestling with. "I think I understand, but it feels strange. I'm used to showing what I'm doing, explaining myself, asking for approval. How do you stay so disciplined without speaking?" The old man smiled, eyes twinkling. "Discipline begins with trust. Trust in the process. Trust in the growth of what you cannot yet see. And trust in yourself. When you honor your dreams with silence, you protect them, and in that protection, they gain strength to withstand the world." Scott nodded slowly, feeling the weight and simplicity of the lesson. The encounter was not dramatic, and there were no grand speeches. It was quiet, patient, and ordinary in the eyes of the world, but extraordinary in its effect. He felt something shift inside him, a seed planted in his own heart, ready to grow if nurtured with the same care and patience. As he walked home that evening, Scott reflected on the encounter. He thought about all the dreams he had spoken aloud, all the times he had sought approval, and all the moments where doubt had crept in after exposing what was not yet ready. The old man had shown him a different way, a path of quiet discipline, patience, and invisible action. He realized that the power of silence was not about hiding, it was about preservation, respect, and trust in what was yet to bloom. This encounter had changed him. It had shifted how he viewed effort, growth, and the fragile beginnings of any meaningful pursuit. And although he did not yet fully understand how this would shape his life, he felt a new sense of purpose, a readiness to protect his dreams, and to allow them to grow unseen, strong, and resilient. Scott left the old man's field that day with a head full of questions. The words "anything still becoming needs protection" echoed in his mind, but he couldn't yet translate them into action. How could silence protect a dream? He had spent years believing that sharing, speaking, and asking for advice were the only ways to grow. And yet here was proof of another path, one that demanded patience, invisibility, and persistence. At first, he tried small experiments. He would jot down ideas in a notebook, then hide it under his bed instead of sharing them. He started practicing skills quietly, alone, in the evenings after school, refusing to show anyone until he was confident they were ready. It felt strange, frustrating, invisible. He wondered if anyone would ever notice, or if it would all be wasted effort. The absence of applause felt unnatural. Human beings craved validation, recognition, but the old man's words were clear: validation could destroy a dream before it had roots. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Scott began to notice the first signs of resistance, not from others, but from himself. Doubt crept into his mind quietly at first, like a shadow stretching over the edges of a bright day. "Am I wasting my time?" he asked himself as he meticulously practiced drawing and writing, often starting projects he didn't dare show anyone. What if no one cares? What if I fail without anyone knowing? The temptation to speak, to explain, to announce his plans, became unbearable. He wanted advice. He wanted reassurance. He wanted someone to cheer him on. His friends, who chattered constantly about their ambitions, could not understand why he stayed quiet. "Why are you wasting time on this?" they asked. "Just tell everyone. Let them help you." Their voices felt like gentle punches to his resolve. Scott wondered if he was wrong, that maybe dreams did need public attention, loud promises, and external validation to survive. But every time he considered breaking the silence, he recalled the image of the old man in the field. How the man knelt each morning, pressing seeds into the soil without fanfare, without witnesses, without acknowledgement. How each seed required patience, consistency, and quiet protection. And slowly, Scott realized that the discomfort he felt, the loneliness, the inner resistance, was part of the process. This struggle, the doubt, the fear, was the soil his own dreams needed to grow. He began to approach his projects differently. Instead of rushing to show progress, he committed to incremental, invisible action. Each day he would work quietly on drawing, writing, or learning, keeping his efforts shielded from opinions. Some days felt like wasted hours. Some days, his confidence faltered so badly he considered giving up. He would sit in his room staring at his notebook, questioning whether any of this effort would matter. But the rhythm of consistency, no matter how small, became a refuge. It reminded him that growth could be slow, unseen, and still unstoppable. Scott also noticed that silence didn't just protect his dreams, it nurtured them. By working quietly, he began to refine ideas without external noise twisting them. No one else's doubts or premature excitement could dilute his vision. He discovered the joy of mastery, the satisfaction of getting better for its own sake, and the profound freedom of acting without a cheering audience. Slowly, a sense of inner discipline took root, a quiet confidence that whispered, "I don't need permission to grow." Even as the world continued to chatter, Scott's commitment to quiet action strengthened. He began to embrace patience as an ally rather than a burden. Every skipped applause, every unacknowledged effort, became a seed of resilience. He realized that endurance in silence was not loneliness, it was a deliberate choice to honor the life he was building within himself. He was learning that transformation rarely comes from loud statements or visible progress. It comes from small, consistent actions taken in the dark, away from judgment and expectation. And then came the first test. A school project demanded teamwork, presentations, and visible results. Scott felt a surge of anxiety. How could he protect his ideas in a world that demanded exposure? He hesitated. Should he risk sharing prematurely? His classmates were all eager to showcase their efforts, hungry for approval. Scott's instinct was to speak up, to announce what he had learned. But he remembered the seeds, the old man, and the truth he had started to accept. Some things are stronger when hidden, invisible until the time is right. So he contributed quietly, doing the work meticulously, letting his actions speak louder than words. When the project succeeded, Scott realized that the quiet discipline he had cultivated not only preserved his dreams, it allowed them to grow stronger than he had imagined. By the end of this phase, Scott had learned a lesson that was both simple and profound. Resistance is natural, doubt is inevitable, but quiet discipline protects, nurtures, and ultimately empowers the dreams we cherish most. Every time he felt like giving up, he remembered that invisible effort mattered more than immediate recognition. His growth, his learning, and his patience were all underground, invisible, preparing for a time when they could emerge fully formed, strong, resilient, and unstoppable. Time passed, and Scott continued to practice the lessons he had absorbed from the old man. The quiet discipline, the patience, the refusal to announce every thought or idea, these practices became his foundation. At first, progress was almost imperceptible. Some days, he felt invisible, unheard, unnoticed. Friends would boast of their achievements, their projects, their progress, and Scott would listen quietly, feeling a flicker of envy. He wondered if he was missing something, if the path of silence was simply a slower, less effective way forward. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, change began to take root. Scott noticed that the work he did quietly, without expectation of recognition, was improving. His sketches were more detailed, his writing more thoughtful, and his understanding of people and systems deeper than ever before. Each unobserved hour of effort was a seed that grew in strength beneath the surface. He began to recognize that what was unseen could be more powerful than what was loud, that the quiet dedication of his daily practice was reshaping him from the inside out. The real turning point came unexpectedly. Scott had been working on a personal project, a series of illustrations that reflected his inner world and the ideas he had kept to himself for years. He had never shared them, not with friends, not with teachers, not even online. One evening, as he reviewed his progress, he noticed something extraordinary. The collection of images formed a narrative far richer than he had imagined. It told a story of growth, patience, and resilience, a story that mirrored his own journey, though he hadn't fully recognized it until now. In that moment, Scott realized that the transformation he had undergone was not about external recognition or validation. It was about who he had become in the process. The person who had once felt insecure, eager to explain himself, and desperate for approval was no longer that same boy. Through months and years of quiet action, he had cultivated focus, resilience, and a confidence that did not depend on applause. He understood for the first time the profound power of nurturing a dream privately, allowing it to grow strong and independent before exposing it to the world. Scott's realization deepened as he reflected on other aspects of his life. He noticed how he had changed in subtle ways, how he listened more attentively to others, how he approached challenges with patience rather than urgency, and how he found satisfaction in consistent effort rather than immediate results. Even the smallest tasks, the routines he had once taken for granted, now felt purposeful. Making his bed each morning, sketching for just 15 minutes, or reading quietly before sleep became deliberate acts of discipline that reinforced his inner growth. He also began to understand the social impact of this transformation. People around him started to notice subtle changes. Friends commented on his calm presence, teachers appreciated his thoughtful contributions, and even strangers seemed drawn to his quiet confidence. Yet Scott did not attribute these changes to luck or talent. He knew they were the result of consistent, patient, invisible effort, a testament to the wisdom he had absorbed from the old man. The lesson was clear: transformation begins internally, often hidden from view, and manifests externally only when it is strong enough to withstand scrutiny. The external success he eventually achieved, awards for his art, recognition for his projects, invitations to share his work, felt different from what he had imagined as a boy. There was no rush of validation, no overwhelming need for approval. Instead, he approached these achievements with a sense of grounded calm, knowing that the real work had been done long before anyone else saw it. The power of silence had preserved his dreams, allowed them to develop fully, and made the recognition that eventually came far sweeter and more meaningful. Scott also began to share the lesson with others, not through lectures, but through example. He encouraged young friends, peers, and even colleagues to cultivate patience, to work quietly, and to protect their own fragile ideas. He discovered that the most impactful teaching was often subtle, lived through action rather than words. By embodying the principles of patience, discipline, and quiet dedication, he influenced others without ever needing to assert authority or demand attention. One pivotal moment crystallized the transformation fully. Scott was invited to present a body of work he had been developing in private for years. As he stood before the audience, he felt a quiet confidence that came from knowing that this work was ready, not because others had pressured him, not because he had announced it prematurely, but because he had nurtured it patiently and privately until it could withstand scrutiny. He realized that the world often rewards loud ambition, but enduring growth rewards patience and quiet discipline. As the audience admired his work, Scott thought of the old man in the abandoned field, kneeling in the soil, planting seeds without expectation. He understood now that his own life had mirrored that same principle. Silent, deliberate action, protected from premature exposure, had allowed his potential to flourish fully. The realization was both humbling and empowering. He had not simply achieved goals. He had transformed himself into the kind of person capable of seeing his dreams through, of nurturing them with care, and of maintaining integrity in the face of pressure or judgment. From that moment onward, Scott approached life differently. He no longer felt the need to justify himself, to explain his plans, or to seek validation. He had learned that true growth happens in the unseen hours, in small repeated actions that accumulate over time. He understood the difference between noise and progress, between performative ambition and disciplined effort. And in this understanding he found a deep sense of freedom. Freedom from comparison, from judgment, and from the fear that speaking too soon could destroy what was still becoming. Scott's transformation was quiet but profound. It touched every aspect of his life, his work, his relationships, and his self-perception. He had internalized the lesson of the old man. Some dreams die when exposed prematurely, but they thrive when nurtured in silence, protected with patience, and tended with care. By embodying this truth, Scott had not only achieved his goals, but he had become a living example of the wisdom he had once observed from afar. The transformation was complete when Scott finally understood the final subtle truth. Life is not about proving ourselves to others, but about cultivating the person capable of achieving, creating, and persevering in the first place. Recognition, applause, and validation are fleeting. What endures is the inner strength developed through disciplined, quiet, and consistent effort, the unseen work that shapes not only dreams, but character itself. And so, as Scott walked through the streets he had once traversed as a boy filled with uncertainty and doubt, he moved with calm purpose, carrying the knowledge that the power of silence, patience, and quiet discipline had transformed him completely. He was no longer just a dreamer. He was a person who had learned to protect, nurture, and grow his potential until it could withstand the world. The realization was simple, yet profound. Some dreams are too precious to expose too soon, and some transformations are too important to rush. Years had passed since Scott first encountered the old man in the abandoned field. What had started as a quiet curiosity had become a lifelong practice, an unspoken agreement with himself to honor the invisible work of his dreams. He often remembered the old man's words, "Anything still becoming needs protection, and protection begins with silence." Those words, once mysterious, had grown into the foundation of his approach to life. Scott's life now had outward signs of success, but it was the invisible growth that mattered most. He had become skilled in ways that no casual observer could measure. His art, his writing, his understanding of people and processes, all had deepened quietly, without the need for constant validation. Where once he had struggled to keep his efforts private, he now understood that the unseen work had strengthened him in ways that public recognition never could. He looked back and realized that the silence he had once resisted had been a form of kindness, not just to his dreams, but to himself. By protecting them from premature exposure, he had given them a chance to become something more than he had ever imagined. Each small, patient act, each long hour of effort without applause, had been a gift to the future version of himself, a self who could walk into the world fully formed, confident, and unshakable. It struck him that this lesson applied far beyond personal ambition. In his interactions with others, Scott began to notice how often people's potential was stifled by early judgment, unsolicited advice, or pressure to perform for attention. He found that by offering space, encouragement, and quiet support, he could nurture growth in ways words alone never could. It was an act of kindness, a form of stewardship, giving others the gift of patience, the room to develop without interference. In his work with friends, colleagues, and even strangers, Scott mirrored the old man's method. He planted ideas, habits, and encouragement subtly, then stepped back to let them grow at their own pace. One afternoon, as he walked through a bustling city park, Scott noticed a young boy sitting alone, sketching quietly in a notebook. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he paused, glancing around nervously, as if waiting for someone to notice. Scott smiled to himself. He saw in the boy's hesitation the same fear he had once carried, the fear that speaking too soon could undo everything. Sitting nearby, Scott didn't speak immediately. He simply observed, offering presence without intrusion. Later, he approached gently and said, "Sometimes, the most important work happens where no one is watching." The boy looked up, confused but intrigued. Scott didn't need to explain. The lesson wasn't in his words. It was in the example of his calm, patient demeanor, and the quiet confidence that came from years of invisible practice. He had learned that teaching through presence, through action rather than proclamation, was far more powerful than giving advice. Reflecting on his own journey, Scott realized the full scope of what he had learned. Dreams, like seeds, require care, patience, and the protection of silence. Early exposure can invite doubt, reshaping, or even destruction. The world is full of voices eager to judge, to push, to advise before understanding. But by embracing quiet discipline, consistency, and patience, one can nurture ambitions until they are strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Scott also understood that success was not merely about achievement, it was about becoming. Each quiet choice, each patient act of persistence, had shaped him into a person capable of creating meaningful work, influencing others positively, and living in alignment with his values. The process itself had been transformative. He no longer measured progress by applause or recognition. He measured it by depth, integrity, and the unseen growth that laid the foundation for enduring accomplishment. Even more, he recognized that silence did not equate to isolation. It was a strategy, a tool, and an act of kindness, toward himself and toward the dreams he protected. By choosing when to speak and when to remain quiet, he had learned to honor the natural rhythm of growth, slow, patient, and resilient. And in this practice, he had cultivated empathy for others, understanding that everyone's potential flourishes in its own time and in its own space. As the sun began to set, Scott walked past the abandoned field where it all began. The land was no longer neglected. Flowers and saplings sprouted where the old man had once planted seeds. Though he never knew it at the time, the old man's act of silent labor had transformed not only the field but the mindset of those who had witnessed even a glimpse of it. Scott bent down and pressed his hand to the soil, feeling a connection to all the invisible efforts that had come before, and to the quiet work that would continue long after him. He understood now that life's most profound transformations were rarely loud. They were cultivated in silence, nurtured through patience, and protected with care. The journey was ongoing, imperfect, and deeply personal, but in that process, a person could become far more than anyone's expectations, including their own. Scott smiled, walking away from the field with a heart full of gratitude. He knew that the lessons he had learned, the discipline of silence, the patience of nurturing, and the quiet act of protecting growth, would continue to shape him for a lifetime. And perhaps somewhere, a young dreamer like him would learn the same truth, that not every dream is meant to be spoken, but every dream deserves to be cared for. In the end, the greatest act of kindness is often silent. It is patience, it is discipline, it is the unwavering belief in what has yet to bloom. And it is in these quiet, unseen moments that the seeds of transformation take root, flourish, and change the world, one invisible, carefully protected dream at a time. Stories like this aren't about motivation, they're about becoming. If this resonated with you, like and share so the video reaches someone who needs it. Subscribe for more wisdom-driven stories that can change how you see your life. And remember, progress is happening, even when it's silent.